Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Far Cry New Dawn for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the follow-up to Far Cry 5. It was developed by Ubisoft Montreal and published in February of this year, and to a fairly mixed reception overall. It tended more towards the positive than the negative, but it was more seen as kind of a middling entry in the series that doesn't really do anything all that new as far as the series is concerned, but it is a slight tweak in comparison to what you saw with Far Cry 5. Now, of course, the big distinction between Far Cry 5 and New Dawn is that New Dawn is a post-apocalyptic game, and its vision of the post-apocalypse is fairly in keeping with what you see in the upcoming Rage 2, where it's much more bright and colorful and vibrant than what you would normally expect from a post-apocalyptic game. But of course the aesthetic is only one aspect of the game, so let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, and whether or not it learned from Far Cry 5's mistakes, it improved upon things, or did something else entirely. And before we get into the meat of the game, let's go ahead and talk about the presentation, which as far as I can tell runs on the same version of the Dunya engine that powered Far Cry 5, although maybe very slightly modified. And it is used to rather solid effect. Generally speaking, the modeling is very well done, the texture quality is pretty solid across the board, animations are generally quite smooth and flow together very well, and the environments themselves can be downright gorgeous at times, with some pretty excessive attention to detail in the foliage in particular. You see, compared to the previous Far Cry game, which was still absolutely gorgeous to look at in terms of environment, they've decided to throw in a lot more vibrant colors this time around, a lot more kind of neon colors, particularly with regards to pink, but also with some other colors as well, and a lot more very vibrant, colorful vegetation that may not necessarily make all that much sense for a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's definitely still aesthetically pleasing nonetheless. In fact, the only real problem with it is oddly enough associated with those bright, vibrant colors, because even though they're generally aesthetically pleasing when you're just wandering around most of the environment, when you get to settlements where there's a lot of the highwayman graffiti, the ridiculously bright neon pink that they use in absolute excess tends to actually strain your eyes after a while, so that is something to keep in mind. But apart from that, they've generally done a very good job with the visuals, and for the most part, the performance is rather solid, although it does occasionally have dips into the high 40s and low 50s on my particular setup. I'm not entirely sure what causes that. It may just be that my drivers are a bit out of date, but it's definitely a situation where your mileage is going to vary. It was never a significant enough problem that it really impacted my gameplay, but it was something I did notice on occasion, and it did get a bit annoying. But there is something that does pretty negatively affect the game, and that's the sound design. And it's in particular one aspect of the sound design, because if you look at solely the sound effects and the voice acting, there's not really anything wrong with it. The voice acting generally gets the job done pretty well, and the characters are generally pretty well voiced, although the main antagonists suffer from a serious problem of not even being the slightest bit intimidating, but that's more from how poorly they're written than how they're acted, because the actors do what they can with what they've got. And of course, if you look at the sound effects themselves, they've generally done a pretty good job with those, although you do have a fair bit of spillover from previous Far Cry games, which is pretty much expected between Far Cry 5 and Far Cry New Dawn. I mean, it's basically a standalone expansion more than anything else, so you would kind of expect the sound effects to be pretty similar, and Far Cry 5 did have some pretty solid sound effects overall, so that ends up not being a real problem. What does end up being a problem is the music, which is split between the licensed tracks and the original stuff that they composed specifically for the game. The stuff that was specifically composed for the game itself is generally decent enough. A lot of it is more electronic than what you saw in previous Far Cry games, and it does try to give something of a post-apocalyptic vibe, but it doesn't work as well as it really could, because they don't really embrace the post-apocalypse all that well. And then, of course, there are the licensed tracks. Now, in some instances, which is mostly comprised of the classic tunes from the 60s and so, it's generally pretty solid. But the millisecond you get within range of a highwayman patrol or a highwayman settlement, or you hop into a highwayman vehicle, it starts playing some of the most atrocious rap I have ever had the displeasure of hearing. And the worst part is, I know that it's completely intentional because they wanted to make sure that the highwaymen are completely irredeemable pieces of absolute detritus But instead of having the desired effect of making you mad at the highwaymen for having such incredibly terrible taste and just being terrible people in general, it instead makes you mad at the developers for putting such absolute garbage into the game to begin with, because if you want to avoid the garbage rap, then you actually have to put the game into streamer mode, which means that all of the licensed tracks are disabled and it only plays the in-game soundtrack, which is fine, don't get me wrong. Again, I've mentioned already that the original soundtrack for New Dawn is perfectly fine, but then you miss out on all of the good licensed tracks, so there's basically a no-win scenario there. Either you leave the licensed tracks on, and you have to put up with some absolutely atrocious rap to be able to have some decent music here and there, or you turn off the licensed music entirely and miss out on the good licensed stuff, but now you don't have to put up with the rap anymore. And the worst part about that is that the amount of terrible rap greatly eclipses the amount of actually decent tracks. So it just ends up making you wonder why they even bothered putting licensed tracks into the game to begin with if the soundtrack was just going to be so bad that it's going to force a huge chunk of the player base just to turn it into streamer mode to avoid that. So when you bring all of the presentation together, those licensed tracks end up being a really unsightly blight on what is otherwise a very solid presentation overall, and it just ends up being a bit baffling. But as baffling as that can be, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this takes place 17 years after the events of Far Cry 5, where, following one of the endings of that game, which is now considered the canon ending, nuclear fire engulfed the world, and thus you now have a post-apocalyptic society trying to survive in what's left of Hope County, which has become surprisingly vibrant and absolutely full of life. In fact, that includes quite a bit of non-mutated life, which, needless to say, is pretty weird in the face of basically nuclear annihilation, but whatever. They basically treat the post-apocalypse as a playground more than anything else. You play as someone known as the security captain. You can select either a male or female character, and of course you can customize their appearance from their clothes and their face and facial hair, whatever their hairstyle is, etc. And then you go forth into the game itself, and you start the game off on a train bound for Hope County, where you and your associates, led by Thomas Rush, are basically trying to go there to help them build up their settlements and make sure that they can survive against any of the antagonists that might be showing up, and of course deal with the wildlife and that sort of thing. Along the way, the train is derailed by the Highwaymen, the main antagonist faction, which is led by the twins Mickey and Lou, and as is now tradition for the Far Cry franchise, you're introduced to them very early on. And right from that point on, you find yourself wishing that Ubisoft did not rely on its villains anywhere near as much as it does, at least as far as the Far Cry series is concerned. Because basically since Far Cry 3, they've been primarily antagonist-driven and not protagonist-driven. It's not necessarily a problem if the antagonists are really strong, and you work around that, but then you get to Far Cry New Dawn, and the entire motivation of the Highwayman faction is doing what they want, whenever they want, and damn the consequences. And Mickey and Lou's entire motivation is to facilitate that by separating the entirety of human existence into two categories: problem solvers and problem makers. And they just want to know which one you are, so they can either kill you if you're a problem maker, or have you join them if you're considered a problem solver. And that's actually it. There's really no depth to these characters or their motivations at all. And from the way Mickey and Lou act, where it's always everyone else's fault, not their own, that they're a bunch of murdering psychopaths who go across the country and destroy anything that gets in their way, and throw temper tantrums whenever people don't immediately acquiesce to their demands, it makes it impossible to see the antagonists as anything other than just a bunch of immature brats who think that they own the world, when they clearly don't. And the fact that they pose basically no real threat to the player makes it just positively laughable, if it were even the slightest bit funny, which it's not. It just ends up being annoying more than anything else. And when you compare that to previous Far Cry villains, at least as far back as Far Cry 3, you find that it's downright insulting to your intelligence just how much they dumbed down the antagonist for New Dawn compared to previous entries. I mean, even as much of a mess as Far Cry 5 was, at least the antagonists had real motivations for doing what they were doing, and even though at first glance it just seemed like they were absolutely insane, when you have the full picture and they explain all of their motivations, you can at least see where they would be trying to get people onto their side, although they had an absolutely terrible way of going about doing it. And what you get from the antagonists in New Dawn is so pathetic, it just ends up being downright insulting to your intelligence, and you just end up trying to focus more on anything but the antagonists. The problem being that the antagonists are ever present, so you're constantly having to deal with them. Now luckily, it's not quite to the same extent as in Far Cry 5, where the game constantly interrupted what you were doing to force you into obnoxious story missions. That doesn't happen in New Dawn. You go on story missions when you're ready to go on them, otherwise you can just do whatever you want in the open world. That said, when you do actually go into the story mode, the story is really nothing more than trying to rescue Thomas Rush after he gets captured by the Highwaymen, and then trying to build up the defenses around Prosperity, which is the new settlement that has arisen in the remains of Hope County, and you're ultimately just trying to build that up so it can defend itself against the Highwaymen and ultimately kick the Highwaymen out. Along the way, you will be interacting with various characters from Far Cry 5, such as the Rye family, or Grace Armstrong, or Herc, and at one point in the story you will learn what ultimately happened to the Eden's Gate cult after the events of Far Cry 5 and leading up to what you see in New Dawn as well, and of course their own struggles against the Highwaymen, because it turns out that they're actually allies this time around, as opposed to the antagonists they were in the previous Far Cry 5. But unfortunately for Far Cry New Dawn, the story and the characters in Far Cry 5 really weren't all that great, so you find yourself not really giving too much of a crap about what happened to them after the events of Far Cry 5, and when you find out what happened to them in New Dawn, it mostly just elicits a shrug more than anything else. You just find yourself not really giving too much of a crap. And really that's a feeling that permeates almost the entirety of the storyline in Far Cry New Dawn. It's not to say that it's all terrible, it does have a couple of missions that are okay here and there, but that's primarily for gameplay reasons and not for actual story reasons. Because between the protagonist's supporting cast and the completely uninteresting and non-threatening antagonists, and the actual events of the storyline just not being all that interesting and tending to drag things on for way longer than they really need to, especially given how insanely predictable they are, you just end up falling into a familiar rhythm of playing it primarily for the gameplay and not for the actual writing, which is basically how Far Cry 5 went as well. The problem with that is that while Far Cry 5 had a fairly decent gameplay formula, Far Cry New Dawn has considerably less on offer, and more importantly, they introduced some changes. So all of the main stuff you saw in Far Cry 5 is still present and accounted for. I mean, it is still a first-person shooter, you still have a throwable slot, you still have med kits that you can use with regenerating health if you're not in combat, you still have, of course, vehicles that you can drive around both in the air, land, and sea, and of course you can still go hunting and or fishing. The main difference is that they implemented a tiering system, so you now have 4 tiers of equipment and 4 tiers of enemies to go along with it, leading all the way up from the most basic all the way to elite. If you try to attack an enemy that is a higher level than whatever gear you're using, you're going to do less damage to them. Similarly, if you're using a higher tier weapon than the enemy you're fighting, then you're actually going to do increased damage against them, so when you get yourself into a fight, either you're going to just completely effortlessly blast through it, or you're going to run into enemies that are all higher tier than what you've got and just completely stomp you into the ground. There is no in-between, and it is very annoying. And to make matters worse, there is absolutely no weapon customization at all, so you can't put different sights or other attachments on the different weapons that you're using, and you just get a situation where what you see is what you get on each individual weapon, and it may not necessarily be configured the way you would really like it to be configured. On top of this, you also need crafting materials to be able to create these different weapons, and some of those crafting materials are very hard to come by, like, say, elite monster skins, which require you to go and fight an elite monster and take it down in order to get that particular skin, and there are very few of those scattered around the map. For other types of rare materials, you might have to go on a treasure hunt, which is the equivalent of going for the prepper stashes in Far Cry 5, where you'll have to complete some sort of challenge, and then it will open up a treasure area where you'll have a bunch of rare materials, a few perk magazines to give you a few extra perk points, and then some of the premium currency that you can spend on the cosmetic items that are available in the game's store. You can also go on side missions called expeditions, which take place on completely different maps than what you see in the main open world, in order to do the exact same thing with every expedition, which is go into a different map, find a single package that after a brief period of time activates a GPS tracker that allows enemies to home in on your position, and then you had to get to the extraction point and hop into the helicopter and fly off before you get taken out by the enemies. It's pretty straightforward, it's very easy to do, and it will net you a lot of materials, including quite a few rare materials. So you're probably going to be going on those fairly often just to get the crafting materials you need in order to get the various weapons that you will need to fight the tougher and tougher enemies. You can also use crafting materials to make med kits or throwables or whatever the case may be, so it's also good to have those. There's also an additional resource called Ethanol that you'll need to be able to upgrade your base. Now, this is something else they introduced with New Dawn, where as you continue to progress through the game and you unlock more and more specialists, which are particular characters that will join the settlement and add their expertise, you will gradually unlock the ability to improve your settlement through various upgrades that will give you many different bonuses. Some of them are passive bonuses, like increasing the level of your guns for hire, which are your companions, of which you can only have one with you this time, as opposed to in Far Cry 5, where you could have two with you at any time. Whereas some of the other upgrades are a bit more active, like, say, giving you the ability to craft higher tier weapons or vehicles so you can take on tougher enemies. So you'll want to prioritize upgrading that, and thus you'll need quite a lot of ethanol. Well, how do you get ethanol? Well, you can complete certain mission types that are found by wandering the open world, mostly things like looting supply drops, which occasionally will show up, or stealing trucks full of ethanol and driving them back to a friendly outpost or settlement, or what I mostly ended up doing, which was clearing outposts and then scavenging them so I could get more ethanol, and then I would have to complete it at a higher tier difficulty in order to get more ethanol, and I could just keep doing this over and over and over again. Which basically means that the main gameplay experience of Far Cry New Dawn is grinding quite a lot for materials, so you can upgrade, so you can grind for more materials, which ultimately means that you're just dealing with a game that has a self-perpetuating grind that never really goes anywhere, and more importantly, it's incredibly easy to get all of the materials you need in a pretty short order, so you run out of things to do extremely quickly. Beyond the story missions, there are the expeditions, which I've already covered, which are all the same, just on different maps. There are the supply truck missions, which I've already covered. There are slightly different supply truck missions, where you can go and take an enemy truck and then it will have a bunch of materials and such in the back. There are the prisoner rescue missions, where you'll just find a prisoner car somewhere in the world, and then if you take out the driver and then open up the cage and back, you free them and you get a perk point. There are the treasure hunts, there are the supply drops, and then there are the outposts. And that's it. There's nothing else to the game. There's no real side missions, there's no real challenges to uncover. I mean, there's a couple of collectibles, but they're incredibly easy to do, and eventually you'll gain access to the upgraded cartography center, which will allow you to just simply purchase whatever maps you want with ethanol, and thus you can simply find wherever it is on the map and go directly to it, thus eliminating the need to just wander around and explore. And when you take everything together and you actually look at what you're dealing with here, Far Cry New Dawn is actually a very short game. If you just went on all of the story content and only did what you need to get the story done, you're looking at maybe 8 hours of gameplay, and even if you do decide to do a completionist run and do literally everything there is to do in the game, it's still going to be maybe 15 hours at most. And if that time were filled with compelling gameplay, and especially a compelling story and characters, then that would be one thing. But unfortunately, it's really not. Most of the perks you can unlock really aren't all that interesting, and most of the difficulty you're going to be running into, even if you crank the difficulty up to the max, is going to be entirely due to the tiering system for the equipment and the enemies, and not from the enemy AI being able to outsmart you or outflank you or anything like that. And while they did certainly learn from at least one mistake that Far Cry 5 made, which was the fact that it constantly interrupted whatever you were doing to drag you into a mandatory story mission that no longer happens in New Dawn, unfortunately that's really the only major improvement we've seen in the entire Far Cry formula, and what you see on offer in New Dawn is actually inferior to most of the previous Far Cry games. And no amount of ricocheting saw blades or attack bores are really going to change that. Ultimately, I give Far Cry New Dawn a 1.5 out of 5. At absolute most, this should have been a DLC for Far Cry 5. Instead, it's a full standalone game, and you can treat it as a standalone expansion. And in that context, it's just not worth bothering with. Thanks for watching.